Wet cobblestones gleamed crimson beneath the banners of Velmoria's royal square. 2 armored guards gripped the arms of a young blind woman who had done nothing more dangerous than listen too well. King Caelric Noctis extended one pale hand, his black iron crown catching the last light of a dying sun, and gave the order without a flicker of hesitation. Darian and Melric moved to carry out their king's command. Then, she whispered a name that had not been spoken aloud in Velmoria for 3 years. The entire square went silent. Caelric Noctis did not build the immortal kingdom of Velmoria into the most feared dominion on the continent by allowing loose ends to breathe. Operating from a black-spired palace that rose above a city of eternal twilight, Caelric had spent 3 centuries forging a court where obedience was the only currency that mattered. He was a king of extraordinary intelligence and absolute ruthlessness, a man who had once ruled with wisdom and a queen at his side, and who now ruled with terror and an empty throne. Queen Evelise vanished 3 years ago on a diplomatic journey from which she never returned. The official account blamed foreign enemies. Caelric believed it. He mourned the way only an immortal can mourn, not with weeping, but with war. He wore his grief like black iron, seamless and impenetrable, and spent the years since turning an entire continent into a battlefield so he would never have to sit quietly with the silence she had left behind. He trusted almost no one now, except Lord Vairian Sable, his closest advisor, who had stood at his right hand since the morning they received news of Evelise's disappearance. Steady and calm and always there, Lyra Everwyn lived in an entirely different Velmoria. Blind since birth, the young harp tuner navigated her world through a tapestry of sound, vibration, and memory so precise it bordered on the supernatural. She possessed absolute pitch, an extraordinary hearing capable of distinguishing a single heartbeat in a crowded room, a lie beneath a practiced voice, a familiar accent buried inside a decade-old disguise. She had never needed sight. Sound was her map, her compass, and her armor. She spent her days traveling between the great estates and ceremonial halls of the kingdom, her velvet tulle roll over her shoulder and her white cane tapping out the rhythm of cobblestones and marble floors. She tuned the harps of the wealthy and the forgotten alike, asked no questions, and carried no opinions about the powerful. She had learned long ago that the powerful preferred it that way. On a gray autumn evening, Lyra was summoned to the royal palace of Velmoria. The ceremonial harp in the palace's ancient east wing had not been played in 3 years, not since the queen who loved it had disappeared. The blood moon ceremony was approaching, and some tradition-bound courtier had decided the harp must be restored to perfect tune before the event. The palace's own musicians refused to enter that chamber. Everyone knew it had been Evelise's private sanctuary. Lyra was dispatched precisely because she would not notice the portraits on the walls. For 2 hours, the only sounds in the forgotten music chamber were the precise strike of tuning pins and the soft, searching resonance of strings returning to life beneath Lyra's careful hands. She worked methodically, unhurriedly, the way she always worked, running her fingertips along the columns' carved wood, pressing her ear close to the soundboard, listening for the truths hiding inside the instrument. She was coiling the last of her tools when the chamber's hidden passage groaned open somewhere behind the east wall. Lyra went completely still. 3 voices entered the adjoining corridor, carrying through the stone with the clarity of bells. The first voice was sharp and quick, the voice of a man performing confidence he no longer felt. The second was lower, military, careful with its consonants. The third was the one that made Lyra's hands stop moving entirely. It was a voice she had heard before, not in this palace, not in this city, but in a small, dimly lit infirmary at the edge of a mountain monastery during a winter storm 3 years ago. A voice she had catalogued without meaning to, the way she catalogued everything, and filed away in the perfect, merciless archive of her memory. Forged orders, the third voice was saying. The witnesses have been moved. The king believes the eastern kingdoms, He will go on believing it as long as we ensure no one tells him otherwise. Lyra did not move. She did not breathe. A heavy tool shifted in her open bag and struck the floor with a sound like a hammer blow in the silence. The corridor went dead quiet. "Someone is in the music chamber," said the military voice. She was found behind the harp before she could reach the door. She was dragged before the king before the sun had fully set. Calric looked at the blindfolded young woman kneeling on the wet cobblestones of his royal square, her lace gown streaked with dust, her cane taken from her. Both armored guards holding her steady, and made the only calculation that had ever made sense to him since Evelise disappeared. Remove the witness. Remove the risk. Kill her, he said. Darian moved. Malric's blade came free of its sheath with a sound like a drawn breath, and Lyra Everwin, who had never once in her life used her gift to save herself, whispered the only word that could stop a vampire king. Evelise. The blade did not fall. Calric stood perfectly still, the order still hanging in the cold air of the square, his pale hand hovering between command and something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Uncertainty. Every courtier, every guard, every noble leaning from their latticed windows to watch the execution, all of them fell silent in precisely the same heartbeat. How did a blind musician know the queen's name? Not just the name. The weight of it. She had not shouted it, had not used it as a plea or a performance. She had whispered it the way someone whispers the name of the dead when they are certain the dead can still hear them. Calric closed the distance between them in 4 steps. Lyra could hear his footfalls on the wet stone, measured, deliberate. The walk of a man accustoming himself to a new emotion he had no vocabulary for. She could smell him, cold iron, aged cedar, and beneath that, something older and quieter, like the dust of a room kept sealed for years. "Where did you hear that name?" he said, and his voice, for the first time in 3 years, was not perfectly controlled. Lyra lifted her face toward the sound of him. Her sightless eyes found nothing and missed nothing. "At a monastery in the Ashenvale Mountains," she said. 3 years ago. From a dying woman who gave me a message she said I must someday deliver to you." She felt the shift in the air around her, every guard suddenly recalibrating, Darian's grip loosening by a fraction. Malric's blade held motionless. "Bring her inside," Calric said at last. His voice was quiet in a way that was more frightening than his commands had ever been. "Bring her to my private chamber." "And if she's lying?" Malric asked. Calric looked at the blind woman on her knees in his square, her white cane gone, her hands trembling, her face turned toward him as though sight had never been the real way to find a person. "Then she dies inside," he said, "where it's warmer." He turned and walked back toward the palace, his crimson cloak dragging across cobblestones still wet from the morning's rain, and Lyra Everwin, still alive, still breathing, still carrying a dead queen's final secret, was guided to her feet and brought into the most dangerous place in Belmoria, the palace she had already heard too much inside. She whispered one name, and the most feared king in Belmoria forgot how to give orders. But here's what nobody in that square understands yet. Lyra didn't just survive an execution. She's been carrying a dead queen's secret for 3 years, waiting for exactly this moment. And she doesn't even know how dangerous that secret truly is. Calric stopped the blade, but stopping a blade and trusting the person who froze it are 2 very different things. And this king hasn't trusted anyone since Evelise disappeared. What happens when he takes Lyra inside that palace and starts asking questions she actually has answers to? Chapter 2 is where everything begins to unravel. Keep watching. The private chambers smelled of old cedar and extinguished candles. Calric had dismissed every attendant, every guard save Darian posted outside the closed doors, and every advisor who had materialized in the corridor with carefully composed expressions of concern. He had dismissed them all with a single look, which was all it had ever taken. Now there was only the fire, the blind girl seated across from him on a high-backed chair, and the name she had whispered still ringing in the cold air between them like a struck string that refused to go silent. He studied her the way he had once studied battle maps, for weaknesses, for angles, for the precise point where something could be broken open. She sat with her hands folded over her knees, her white cane leaning against the chair's arm, her sightless eyes aimed at the middle distance. She had stopped trembling. That, more than anything else, irritated him. "You will tell me," he said, "exactly where you heard that name, every detail, every word. You will leave nothing out, and you will not embellish because I will know." Lyra turned her face toward him, not at his eyes, but toward the sound of his voice, locating him with unsettling precision. "I was 20 years old," she said, "traveling north through the Ashenvale Pass after finishing a commission in the Valley Estates. A winter storm came down without warning. The monastery at Greyvale opens its infirmary to travelers when the mountain roads close." She paused. "I stayed 4 nights. On the 2nd night, they brought a woman in. Calric said nothing. The fire shifted. She arrived after dark in a covered cart with 2 people I never heard speak above a whisper. The monks were told she was a noble woman who had suffered an accident on the road. She was placed in the bed beside mine." Lyra's hands tightened slightly over her knees. "She was badly hurt. I could hear it in every breath, the way pain changes the rhythm of a person, the way it makes even the air around them feel different. She was also terrified. That has its own sound." She asked after some time whether anyone else was in the room. I told her I was there. She asked if I was blind. Lyra's voice steadied. When I said yes, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Then perhaps the darkness chose you to keep what sighted men would destroy." Calric rose from his chair. He crossed to the window and stood with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, staring out at the dark spires of Velmoria rising against a sky with no moon. "She made me memorize a message," Lyra continued. "She said I must deliver it to King Calric of Velmoria. She said I must tell him that the enemy he was searching for beyond his borders had never existed. She said, 'The snake does not come from outside the garden. It has always eaten at your table.' She told me not to trust the council's account of her disappearance. She said the investigation had been shaped by the same hands that caused it. You are lying." His voice was very quiet. "I'm not. Evelis vanished on a diplomatic journey. My own intelligence confirmed the Eastern Kingdoms." "Your intelligence was curated," Lyra said, with a gentleness that was somehow worse than accusation. "That was part of what she told me. That anything you were shown afterward had been prepared for you to find." He turned from the window. In the firelight, his face was all sharp angles and controlled fury. Centuries of accumulated authority pressed into a single expression that had preceded the deaths of warlords and kings. "Any clever spy," he said, "with enough patience and a reliable informant could construct the story. The name, the warning, all of it." "Yes," Lyra agreed. "They could." She reached into the collar of her traveling gown and withdrew her hand slowly, giving him every opportunity to see she was not reaching for a weapon. Her fingers found something around her neck, a fine chain, and she lifted it over her head with careful hands. Before she stopped speaking, Lyra said, "She asked me to repeat the message back to her 3 times, to be certain I had it exactly." She held the chain out toward his voice, the small charm at its end catching the firelight. Then she said, "Tell him the silver thread always leads home. He will understand. No one else will." The room became very still. Calric did not move for a long moment. When he crossed to her, it was not with the deliberate authority he used for everything else. He took the chain from her fingers. A small silver charm, shaped like a single harp string, knotted at one end into a tiny, intricate loop. He recognized it. He had given it to Evelis the winter before she disappeared, a private thing, fashioned by a silversmith in the lower city, carrying a phrase only the 2 of them had ever spoken. "The silver thread always leads home." "She said it opened something," Lyra said quietly. She said there is a chamber beneath the palace, a room where she kept everything that could prove what happened to her. She said only someone who could truly listen would be able to find the door. Kaelric closed his fingers around the charm. The fury in his face had not left, but underneath it now, unmistakably, was something he had not allowed himself in 3 years. Horror. And the first terrible, unwanted splinter of hope. He told no one where they were going. He sent Darian ahead to clear the lower corridors and brought Malric to the private chamber door with a single quiet instruction. Tell the court I am not to be disturbed until morning. Malric had looked at the blind girl standing beside the king with an expression he was too disciplined to name, then nodded once and moved to carry out the order. They descended through passages Lyra could not see, and the court had long since stopped remembering. Kaelric walked without a torch. He had never needed one. Lyra followed the sound of his footsteps, her replaced cane tapping a careful rhythm against stone floors that grew older and colder with every level they descended. Dressed granite giving way to rough-cut rock, the palace's ornate bones giving way to something that had been built before beauty was the point. The Hall of Echoes, Kaelric said, when they stopped before a set of iron doors taller than 2 men, green with centuries of neglect. The first vampire monarchs built it as a music chamber, acoustics for ritual performance. It has not been opened in decades. Someone opened it recently, Lyra said. He looked at her. The iron, she said. The oxidization on old doors sounds different when it's been disturbed. The hinges have been reseated. She paused. Within the last few years, I would guess. Darian, standing at Kaelric's left, said nothing. Malric had not yet arrived from the upper corridors. Kaelric pushed the doors open. The Hall of Echoes was a ruin of beauty. Black marble pillars rose into a vaulted darkness overhead, carved with the names of compositions no one performed anymore. Along the walls, instruments had been mounted in ceremonial brackets and then abandoned to slow decay. Harps with snapped strings hanging like broken ribs, ceremonial bells cracked through their middles. A clavichord with its lid collapsed inward from years of damp and silence. The floor was a mosaic of pale stone, depicting musicians whose faces had been worn smooth by time. Lyra stood in the center of it and was very still. You can hear something, Kaelric said. It was not a question. The room is still acoustically intact, she said quietly. Under all the disrepair, the shape of it, the way sound moves. She turned slowly, her head tilting. There. She pointed toward the far eastern wall where a section of black marble sat undecorated between 2 pillars. The stone there returned sound differently, its hollow behind it. Kaelric crossed to the wall and pressed his palm flat against it, solid to touch. No seam he could find. Evelis said it opens to a precise resonance, Lyra said, already moving toward him, her fingers finding the silver charm at her collar. May I have it back? He placed the chain in her hand without argument. She held the tiny harpstring charm between her fingers and plucked it once, a sound so small it should have been swallowed immediately by the enormous room. Instead, the Hall of Echoes did exactly what it had been built to do. The note expanded, traveled, and returned. Lyra listened to what came back. She adjusted the angle, plucked it again. Once more, she said, half to herself. She moved 2 steps to the left, raised the charm slightly, and struck the string with a precise, deliberate touch. The note that was returned was different. The wall opened, not dramatically. No grinding stone, no dramatic mechanism. A single vertical seam appeared and a panel swung inward on a counterweight so well balanced it moved at a touch, revealing a narrow chamber beyond. Kaelric entered first. Lyra followed. Darian came last, holding a torch now, its light falling across shelves cut directly into the rock. Evelis had been thorough. Journals filled the first shelf, small, leather-bound, written in a hand Kaelric recognized with a physical jolt that he did not allow to show on his face. Sealed letters behind them, organized by date. Rolled maps with coded annotations. and below those a collection of documents that were not Evelise official royal orders, stamped with the palace seal, bearing signatures and transfer authorizations and investigative redirections, spanning 3 years of carefully managed deception. Kaelric read in silence. It was Darian who saw his own name first. He lifted a transfer order from the shelf with the careful handling of a man hoping proximity might change what the document said. His signature appeared at the bottom, his seal, his authorization, redirecting 3 witnesses from a royal inquiry to a monastery in the eastern provinces, witnesses who had subsequently never been found. "I never signed this," he said. His voice was steady. His face was not. Malric arrived through the chamber entrance, took one look at the room, and went very still. He found his own name moments later, on 4 separate orders he had no memory of issuing. "Someone copied our seals," Malric said. "Someone did considerably more than that," Kaelric replied. He set down the document he was holding. Lord Vidarian Sable's name appeared in Evelise's journals 11 times across 8 entries, not as an ally, not as a courtier, but as an architect, a man who had spent years making himself indispensable to a grieving king while quietly dismantling every thread that might have led that king back to the truth. Malric's jaw was set hard. Darian had not put the forged order down. None of them heard the soft scrape of a boot withdrawing from the passageway outside the iron doors. By the time Lyra turned her head toward the sound, it was already gone. Quick, light-footed, moving fast back toward the upper corridors and the man who was waiting, as he always waited, to be told everything. They returned to the upper palace before dawn, and Kaelric did what he had always done best. He performed. By the time the court assembled for the morning audience, the king was already seated on his throne, composed, unhurried, wearing last night's revelations nowhere on his face. Lyra had been given a chamber in the east wing, and an instruction that arrived through Darian with characteristic economy. Stay close. Say nothing. Listen to everything. She had been doing that her entire life. Vidarian Sable arrived at the throne room precisely when he always arrived, neither early enough to seem anxious nor late enough to suggest disrespect. He was an ancient vampire, older than most of the palace's stonework, and he moved with the particular grace of someone who had spent centuries ensuring he was never the most obviously dangerous person in a room. Silver-haired, immaculately dressed, his voice carrying the warm resonance of a man accustomed to being listened to. "My king," he said, settling into his customary position at Kaelric's right. "The Eastern envoys await your reply regarding the border negotiations." "Let them wait," Kaelric said pleasantly. "I want to revisit something first." He asked about the Cottonmere campaign, a border war from 2 years prior, launched on intelligence suggesting a rival kingdom had sheltered agents involved in Evelise's disappearance. He asked with the casual tone of a king reviewing old ledgers. Which council members had presented that intelligence? Who had corroborated it? Which witnesses had provided the original testimony? Varian answered every question without a visible pause. The testimony had come from 3 sources, all now deceased. The intelligence had been verified through standard channels. The campaign had been regrettable but necessary, smooth, practiced. Exactly as smooth and practiced as it would have been if it were true. Lyra sat in a chair positioned slightly behind the throne to its left, ostensibly present as the palace's newly appointed royal musician, a title Kaelric had invented that morning and delivered with such flat authority that no one had questioned it. She held her cane across her lap and kept her face neutral and her ears open. She heard Vidarian's heartbeat change the first time Kaelric mentioned Evelise's name. Not dramatically, not the lurch of guilt in someone unaccustomed to carrying it. This was the subtler adjustment of a man who had been managing the same careful weight for years. A fractional quickening, a slight deepening of breath, a shift in the fabric of his sleeve as his hand moved a 1/4 inch, and then was still again. She heard it every time. She heard it in the slight elongation of his vowels when he said her disappearance, the unconscious extra half-second a person takes when they are selecting a word they have rehearsed. She heard it in the pause before regrettable, which lasted precisely long enough for him to decide it was the right performance note. Varian was an exceptional liar. He was simply lying to a room that had never before contained someone who could hear the difference between a steady heartbeat and a managed one. He noticed her. She felt his attention shift the way a temperature shifts. Not sudden, but definite. During a recess in the morning audience, she heard him cross to Calric near the window embrasure, his voice lower to the register that courtiers used when they wanted to appear to be offering counsel rather than instruction. "The harp tuner," he said. "I would advise removing her from the throne room." "She is the royal musician," Calric said. "She belongs in the throne room. She is a blind peasant girl who was nearly executed yesterday for witnessing a private council discussion. Her presence here reads as a provocation." A brief pause. "There is also the matter of what she may have heard. Peasant superstition given royal proximity has a way of becoming rumor, and rumor has a way of becoming destabilizing." "Are you suggesting," Calric said in a tone of mild interest, "that I should execute her after all?" "I'm suggesting it would be tidier." "How thoughtful of you, Varian." Calric's voice carried nothing. "I'll consider it." He did not consider it. The assassins came before the evening bell. Lyra heard them first. 4 distinct gates moving through the servant corridor that ran parallel to the east wing, too deliberate for household staff, carrying the particular silence of people trained to produce it. She told Darian in 11 words, and Darian told Malrek, and the corridor was waiting for them before they reached the door. 2 escaped. 2 did not. The one Malric brought before Calric in the lower guard room was carrying a standard courier's seal on his belt pouch, and beneath it in a smaller inner pocket that had been sewn shut and then carefully reopened, a black signet ring. The crest pressed into its face was small and precise, a sable tree on a field of 3 stars. Varian's private seal. Calric held it for a long time. Then he sets it down on the table with the careful placement of a man who knows that the next thing he does will be permanent. He returned to the throne room for the evening address with the signet in his pocket and Lyra 1 step behind him. Varian was already there, standing beside the throne with his hands folded, his expression arranged into its customary expression of patient authority. He watched Calric ascend the dais. He watched the blind girl take her chair. Something in his face shifted imperceptibly to everyone else in the room. Not to Lyra. She heard his heartbeat change for the last time that evening. Not the managed adjustment of a careful liar, but the single hard contraction of a man who has just understood that the game has changed and he is no longer the one who changed it. He turned his head toward her slowly. His lips moved without sound, precise, deliberate, making sure she would hear even the shape of the words if her ears could reach them. "You should have died in the square." Lyra did not look away. She had no eyes to look with, but she turned her face directly toward him, and she let him see that she had heard every word. The blood moon rose the color of an open wound. Lyra heard the ceremony begin from her chamber, the ceremonial bells in the correct sequence, the procession of boots across the upper courtyard, the distant harmonics of the restored harp being carried into the throne room. She had tuned it herself that afternoon, running her fingers along every string until the instrument sang exactly as it should. She was still awake when the bells changed. Not obviously. A listener without training would have heard only the ceremonial peal continuing, but the sequence shifted, a transposition of the 3rd and 5th bells, too precise to be an error, producing a pattern she had never heard before, a signal. She was on her feet and reaching for her cane before the first screams started. The darkness came from everywhere at once, not the natural dark of extinguished torches, something older and more deliberate, a magical compression of shadow that dropped over the throne room like a sealed lid. Lyra heard it happen. The specific way sound changed when light disappeared, the subtle alteration in how voices bounced off walls, and beneath that, the thunder of armored bodies flooding through the throne room's secondary entrances. She heard Calric's voice cut through the chaos, 2 words clipped and absolute. and then the sound of his blade leaving its sheath. Darian found her in the darkness before she found him, his gauntleted hand closing around her arm with controlled urgency. "Stay behind." The assassin came from his left. Lyra heard the armor joint at the attacker's shoulder rotate a half-second before the strike. "Left," she said. Darian moved. The blade caught him across the upper arm instead of the throat. He went down on one knee, caught himself, and drove the attacker back with his elbow. But there was a second one already behind him. Lyra swung her cane hard at knee height in the direction of the second set of footsteps. The carbon connected. The assassin stumbled. Darian finished it. "You're hurt," Lyra said. "Functional," he said, which she suspected meant considerably hurt. "Can you hear the king?" She was already listening. Calric was 20 feet ahead, surrounded. She could track him by the rhythm of his movement, the controlled economy of a fighter who had lived long enough to stop wasting energy, and by the sounds collapsing around him, blades deflected, bodies meeting the marble floor, the particular silence that followed each engagement before the next one began. She moved toward him with Darian one step behind, bleeding quietly and not complaining about it. "3 steps left," she said, pitching her voice exactly loud enough to reach him. "Duck. Blade above your throat." A beat of silence. Then the sound of Calric dropping and something whistling through the space where his neck had been. "Malric, behind you." From somewhere to her right, she heard Malric's sharp exhale as he spun, and then the grunt of an attacker who had expected a blind spot that no longer existed. They converged on each other through the darkness like a ship following a lighthouse. Calric moving toward her voice. Malric fighting his way across the room. Darian holding her left side with one good arm. Around them, the assassins had numbers and darkness and every advantage that should have mattered. None of them had Lyra. She called out positions, distances, directions. She heard blades leave sheaths before the wielders had completed the motion. She heard breathing patterns shift from controlled to desperate and knew which attackers were tiring before they did. She heard the specific acoustic signature of the throne room's eastern door opening and warned Calric of the second wave before it arrived. When it was over, when the last armored body had met the floor and the darkness was full of nothing but the sound of 3 people breathing hard, Malric said with considerable feeling, "She is not helpless." "No," Calric said, "she is not." Then Lyra heard the lower passage door. "The Hall of Echoes," she said. "Someone is going down." They moved. The evidence was already burning when they arrived. 2 of Vairian's men had gotten there ahead of them, and Evelise's journals were open on the floor with a torch held above them. Calric took the first man before he cleared the doorway. Malric handled the second, but the torch had already fallen, and the closest journal's corner was catching. Lyra went for it without thinking. She heard Calric shout behind her, not a command, something rawer than that, and she found the journal by the heat of the flame at its edge and pulled it against her chest, smothering the fire against her traveling coat. It burned through to her arm before she got it out. Calric was beside her immediately. His hand closed over her burned forearm with a careful pressure that was entirely unlike every previous way he had touched her. "I have it," she said. He did not let go immediately. They heard him before they saw him, though in the darkness, seeing had become largely irrelevant. Varian's footsteps were unhurried. He entered the Hall of Echoes the way he entered every room, as though he had arranged for it to exist. Something small and metallic turned in his hands. Lyra heard the delicate, unmistakable sound of a broken crown's remaining stones shifting against fractured gold. "She was alive for 8 months after the bombing," Varian said conversationally, his voice carrying easily through the ancient chamber. "I thought you deserved to know that." The silence that followed was absolute. 8 months, he continued, during which she tried twice to reach you and was prevented both times. "She was remarkably tenacious, your queen." He set the broken crown down on the nearest stone surface with a sound like a closing door. "I always respected that about her." Calric's breathing had changed. Lyra said nothing. She stood with the burned journal against her chest and listened to the sound of a man discovering that his grief had been a managed performance, that the story he had been given about his own loss was a script, carefully edited with 8 months cut from the end. "I would like," Calric said, very quietly, "to hear everything." "I thought you might," Bayurian said. "Shall we finish this properly?" Vierion did not confess the way guilty men confess. He spoke the way he did everything, with the measured cadence of someone who had rehearsed for an audience and found, at the last, that the audience was finally worth performing for. He moved to the center of the Hall of Echoes and stood between the broken harps and the black marble pillars as though he had chosen the staging himself. Perhaps he had. He had chosen everything else. "Evelise was always the cleverer of the two of you," he began. "You were formidable, Calric, brilliant in war, absolute in authority, but you trusted the people you loved." She understood that this was a vulnerability. I simply understood it first. He had been diverting royal blood tides for 11 years, small enough amounts redirected through enough intermediary channels that no single audit would have caught it. He had been building quiet alliances with kingdoms Calric believed were enemies, alliances contingent on those kingdoms remaining enemies, because an isolated Velmoria required an indispensable advisor in a way a secure one never would. He had been constructing, patiently and with great craftsmanship, a king who needed him. "Evelise found the ledgers," Bayurian said. "Not all of them, I was careful, but enough. She brought her evidence to 2 council members before she brought it to me." A brief pause. "That was her error. Both men were already mine." She had been removed from the diplomatic journey before it reached its destination. The carriage had been redirected. The escort was replaced. The official account, ambushed by foreign agents, no survivors, no remains recovered, had been written before she was taken because Verine had learned to complete the paperwork early. "She escaped," he said, and for the first time something moved behind his composure. Not regret, but the professional acknowledgement of a problem that had been more persistent than anticipated. "She was injured. One of my men was less thorough than instructed. She reached a monastery in the Ashenvale Pass during a winter storm, which is where, I eventually discovered, she spent her remaining time." 8 months, Calric said. 8 months. Varian inclined his head. "By the time I located her, she was already gone. The monks had no useful information. I found no useful information. I found no evidence she had spoken to anyone." He glanced toward Lyra with the expression of a man revising an old assumption. "Apparently I was insufficiently thorough." The Hall of Echoes was very quiet. Lyra stood with the burned journal still held against her chest and listened to Calric not moving. She had learned his silences by now. The controlled ones, the furious ones, the ones that preceded decisive action. This was none of those. This was the silence of a man standing in the wreckage of 3 years of his own life and understanding, for the first time, the precise dimensions of the architecture that had been built around him. Every campaign, every enemy kingdom dismantled, every alliance broken, every execution ordered in the name of finding the people responsible. All of it built on a foundation that Vayuran had poured. "Lyra," Calric said. His voice was steady. She understood what the steadiness cost him. "She gave me the full message," Lyra said quietly. "At the monastery. I have carried it exactly." She had. Every word, every inflection, memorized with the same precision she gave to every piece of music she had ever been asked to hold. She said, "I do not blame him. I have never blamed him. I only fear what grief will make him into, whether he will let the loss of me become permission to lose himself entirely." She said, "Tell him the man I loved was not the crown. The man I loved existed before the iron and will exist after it if he chooses to. Tell him I spent my last months not in despair, but in the certainty that the truth would reach him. That I trusted the darkness to carry it safely." Lyra paused. She said, "Tell him I would do it again. Every day of the 8 months I would do it again, because he was worth the truth even when the truth was costly." The fire from the partially burned journals had died to embers. The Hall of Echoes held the words the way it held every sound, completely without judgment, giving them back to the room unchanged. Cowrick made no sound, but Lyra heard what happened to his breathing. "Extraordinary," Varian said. "She spent 8 months dying and used the time to send you absolution." He moved, a single step, unhurried. "It changes nothing, of course. The wars happened. The kingdoms fell. The people who died in campaigns, fought on manufactured evidence, died regardless of how tenderly she felt about you. She loved a king who was capable of being better than he became. That king, I'm afraid, has been rather thoroughly dismantled." Another step. "Her truth came too late, Cowrick. And her love, as I always suspected, simply made you easier to break." Lyra heard it then, beneath his cloak. The specific sound of a blade already drawn, held flat against the forearm, the grip adjusted by fingers that had been preparing the angle for the last 30 seconds while his voice provided the distraction. "Left shoulder," she said. "Now." Cowrick moved. The blade meant for his throat opened his sleeve instead, and then his hand closed around Valerian's wrist and the two of them separated with the violence of a collision, each landing in the ready position of someone who had been fighting for centuries. Varian looked at Lyra across the ruined chamber. "You," he said, with something that might have been genuine appreciation, "are extraordinarily inconvenient." The duel began. 3 years of war. 3 years of grief, 3 years of ruling an entire kingdom through fear and fury, and every single day of it was built on a lie, Varian planted and carefully watered. Evelise never blamed him. She spent her last 8 months not in bitterness but in the quiet, stubborn belief that the truth would find its way home, that he was worth the cost of delivering it. And now Cowrick finally knows. But knowing the truth and surviving the man who buried it are two entirely different things. And Valerian just made his move. The duel has started. The darkness is absolute, and the only person who can see clearly inside it is a blind harp tuner holding a burned journal against her chest. Chapter 7 is the ending this story deserves. Don't stop now. Varian fought the way he had done everything else, with patience, misdirection, and the absolute confidence of a man who had never needed to be the strongest person in a room because he had always ensured he was the most prepared. The illusions came first. Cowrick's reflection appeared on every polished surface of the Hall of Echoes simultaneously, a dozen versions of Valerian moving in perfect synchronization, each one carrying a blade, each one stepping with identical rhythm across the ruined mosaic floor. The magic was old and precisely calibrated, designed for an opponent who depended on sight to find the real body beneath the performance. Varian had not accounted for an opponent who had stopped depending on sight an hour ago. "Third pillar," Lyra said, from the wall where Darian had positioned her. 8 feet. He favors his left. Cowrick drove toward it. 2 of the reflections vanished on contact. The third met steel. Varian disengaged, fast bleeding from his sword arm, and the darkness came down again. Not the manufactured blackness of the coup, but something older drawn from the hall's own acoustics. A suffocating compression of shadow and silence designed to disorient. It silenced everything except Lyra's voice. Outside in the upper corridors, Darian and Malric were holding the stairwell against the last of Valerian's guard. 6 rebels who had expected a coup already won and found instead 2 royal guards with a combined grievance that had been building since they discovered their own forged signatures on a shelf beneath the palace. Malric fought without particular elegance and with considerable effectiveness. Darian fought with one arm at reduced capacity and compensated but positioning, using the narrow stairwell to neutralize the numerical disadvantage with the focused intensity of a man who had been personally insulted by the evening's events. The stairwell held. Inside the hall, Varian shifted his approach. The illusions collapsed. The darkness remained. And Varian stopped moving toward Cowrick. He moved toward Lyra. She heard him redirect. The subtle change in his footfall pattern, the slight adjustment of his breathing from the controlled rhythm of active combat to the quieter deliberateness of a man crossing a room with a specific destination. She had perhaps 2 seconds to process that she had become the target and that Kelrick was currently on the wrong side of the chamber. She did not move. There was nowhere useful to go, and moving blind through a darkened room full of broken instruments and debris would only produce noise that obscured his position. She listened instead. He was fast. Genuinely fast, in the way ancient vampires were fast. Not the speed of effort, but the speed of a body that had spent centuries becoming more precisely itself. She tracked him by the displaced air, by the shift in the room's ambient sound as his mass moved through it, by the grain of his boot heel on the mosaic floor. She called out his position to Kelrick, but Varian had anticipated this. The poisoned silver blade left his hand in the last half-second, thrown rather than thrust, and Lyra heard it too late to do anything except flinch. She heard Kelrick instead, 3 long strides crossing the chamber in the time it should have taken 5, and then the impact of a body intercepting the blade's path. And then the sound of Kelrick's sharp exhale as the silver opened his shoulder. The wound would not kill him, but it would slow him. That had been the calculation. What Bayerian had not calculated was what it would do to Kelrick's temperament. "He's breathing shallow on the right," Lyra said, her voice completely level. "The illusion replicates his movement but not his lungs. The real body is always the one with the irregular breath. He's been managing a chest injury since the hall, 7 feet directly ahead of you. The blade is in his left hand now. He'll come high." Silence. Now. The sound that followed lasted 4 seconds. When it ended, only one person in the Hall of Echoes was still standing, and Vyerian Sable, architect of 11 years of managed deception, was on his knees on the ruined mosaic with Kelrick's blade at his throat, and nothing left to say that anyone was prepared to listen to. He said nothing. To his credit, or perhaps simply out of habit, he maintained his composure to the last. Kelrick held the blade steady for a long moment. Then he made the decision that Evelis had spent 8 months hoping he would someday be capable of making. He called for Darian. He called for Malric. He sheathed his blade, and he let Volmoria's justice system, which he intended to rebuild from the foundation, handle the rest. It took 3 weeks. The evidence from Evelis's chamber was presented to the full court in a session that lasted 2 days. Varian's network of intermediaries, documented in the journals with Evelis's characteristic thoroughness, unraveled with the particular speed of a conspiracy whose architect was no longer available to manage it. 11 council members were removed. 6 were tried. The forged campaigns were acknowledged in formal royal decree, a document that cost Kelrick more to sign, Lyra suspected, than the duel had cost him physically. The kingdoms that had lost people to manufactured wars received acknowledgement. Not enough. Nothing would be enough. But it was a beginning, and beginnings, Lyra had learned from a lifetime of tuning neglected instruments, were the only place anything could start. Darian and Malric were formally reinstated, not by royal command, but by Kelrick, asking them directly, in private, without ceremony, whether they were willing to stay. They were. The distinction mattered to all 3 of them. Lyra packed her tool roll on the morning of the 4th week. She was methodical about it. The tuning hammer first, then the smaller levers, then the mutes and the bridge pins and the harp string gauge she had carried since her first commission at 17. She ran her fingers over each item the way she always did, confirming presence by touch, and told herself she was glad to be going home. She was halfway through this telling when Kelrick knocked on the open door of her chamber. She heard him stop in the doorway. She heard him not speak for a moment, which was unusual. "The Hall of Echoes needs a keeper," he said finally. "Someone who understands what it holds and can ensure it doesn't become what it was, a forgotten room full of things no one tends." Lyra set down the tuning hammer. "You have archivists for that. I have archivists for documents. I need someone who understands that the room itself is an instrument." A pause. "I also need a royal musician. The harp has been silent for 3 years. The palace sounds wrong without it." Those are two separate arguments for the same request, Lyra said. You're negotiating. I am asking, he said with the careful precision of a man practicing a skill he had let atrophy for a very long time. Lyra was quiet for a moment, her hands resting on the packed tool roll. If I stay, she said, you rule differently. Not through fear, not through managed grief. You rebuild the council with people who will tell you what is true rather than what is safe. You acknowledge the wars formally and you begin making them right. She paused. And you tune the harp yourself once a month. I will teach you. It requires patience and the willingness to listen until you hear what is actually there rather than what you expected. The silence that followed was the longest she had heard from him. Those are significant terms, he said. You are going to execute me in a square, she said. I am being reasonable. He gave her the key on the morning she moved her belongings to the Hall of Echoes. It arrived in a small cedar box, silver, the length of a tuning key, its handle engraved with a precision that suggested someone had spent considerable time on it. She turned it in her fingers, reading the braille with her thumb, the raised dots spelling out their message in the quiet of the newly restored chamber. You were born without sight, yet you showed a king the truth hidden in darkness. Lyra held it for a long moment. Then she set it beside Evelise's journals, on the shelf where it would stay, and she crossed to the harp that had been moved from the ceremonial east wing to the center of the Hall of Echoes. And she sat down on the bench and pressed her ear close to the soundboard the way she always did, listening first before touching anything for what the instrument needed. Outside the hall's iron doors, she could hear the palace beginning its morning. Footsteps, voices, the distant bells ringing in the correct sequence. She could hear Darian's measured tread in the corridor, and somewhere above her, the sound of Velmoria's city coming to life in the particular way that cities do when the thing that had been wrong about them for years has finally imperfectly begun to be corrected. She found the first string that needed adjustment. Through the high, narrow window cut into the ancient stone, the light that touched the Hall of Echoes was the pale, unhurried gold of early dawn, the first clean morning Velmoria had seen in years, pressing itself against a city that did not yet know what to do with it, but was in the careful and provisional way of things that have been a long time in darkness beginning to learn. Lyra began to tune.